Hello and welcome to this roundtable discussion on the critical question of women's rights in Afghanistan after the takeover of Taliban. This discussion is hosted by the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at the Observer Research Foundation as part of a series of roundtables on development challenges like food security, health, and gender in Afghanistan with the current crisis. My name is Sunaina Kumar, and I am a senior fellow with the Center for New Economic Diplomacy. Research has shown that promoting gender equality benefits not only women but the entire economy. Gender equality is a core aspect of sustainable development. After 4 decades of conflict combined with extreme patriarchy, the situation for women has progressively worsened and propelled Afghanistan to the bottom of the global gender gap index. Studies have shown that nearly 70% loss in development in the country is due to the limited participation of women in the workforce, low education, and poor health outcomes for women. The small gains that were made for women's education, participation in work, and political representation are at risk of being reversed even as the brave women of Afghanistan continue to protest on the streets. What will be the future of half of Afghanistan's nearly 40 million people, its women and girls? Is there a role for the international community in supporting the rights of women in Afghanistan? While the picture that emerges is undoubtedly grim, we can only hope that conversations like these point us towards where we should focus our energy and look for solutions. To discuss all this, we have a very diverse and interesting panel and an all women panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone today. Mariam Wardak is a social rights activist and the founder of Her Afghanistan and former advisor to the Afghan government. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. Heather Barr is the co-director of women's rights at Human Rights Watch and a researcher on Afghanistan. She's joining us from Islamabad. Lakshmi Puri is the former Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations and former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. She's joining us from Delhi. And Mamta Kohli is Senior Social Development Advisor, Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office in India. She's joining us from Delhi as well. Thank you very much. And a warm welcome to all of you. We will open with comments from each of our speakers. Before we dive further into this conversation, let's just get this started by getting Mariam into the conversation. Mariam, this has been a very tough and unpredictable time, especially for women. And for you, this is also personal. Can you share with us what is it that you are thinking as you watch this unfold far from your home?
Well, there's a few things that I want to dive into before I talk about how personal this is. We have to do a proper reflection of what has happened in the past 20 years, what has gone wrong, and how we have approached women's rights within Afghanistan. Then we also need to look at the limited social freedoms that have incorporated, how some of the laws, unspoken laws, are something that are more embedded in tradition versus Sharia. We have to understand that the Taliban currently are in majority an uneducated population, a population that has very limited interaction with women and limit understanding of how a government must function. Aside from that, we have to understand that this is now an Emirates and it is not a democratic institution. We have to understand that this regime could possibly hide anything that has any direct connection to acts of harm, especially on women. We have to understand that the type of political system which will be applied in Afghanistan is definitely not clear, and that the only thing that's confirmed is Sharia that will be applied, which is Islamic law. And this is a set of ranging morals from, a broad ethical principles drawn basically from our holy book. Now, the problem that I've witnessed not only in the past 2 years of engaging with the Taliban, but what I've witnessed with the international community is the lack of cultural understanding. disconnecting and implying what they see in their respective nations on how women could advance to how women should advance in Afghanistan. One good example is when the negotiations with the Taliban were taking place. Her Afghanistan, the organization that I run, constantly advocated for female Islamic scholars delegation to make one stance and to also to speak the only language that the Taliban seem to hold their campaign on, which is Islam. You know, there are certain facts about Islam, about the Quran, that many, even Muslims in Afghanistan, rarely understand. So it is it's a comprehensive, the Quran is a comprehensive way of life. It's not a rule book. There's 6,200 verses in the Quran Sharif, and only 260 of them address legal matters. But 750 of them, the verses, tell believers to reflect and use reason. Now, when we have information such as this, or we have individuals who can elaborate and communicate how we can effectively use our religion and apply it in our daily lives, I think that's how we can move forward and allow women to have their rights. A perfect example of this that I would like to reflect on is a female named Fatima Gilani, who comes from a very strong political family, but she was the only Islamic scholar who was working at the Afghan Red Crescent, and was able to use Quran verses and hadiths in order to complete most of her missions, especially in areas that were Taliban focused. And I saw how effective that was. The concern here is I am worried about the human rights of everybody, the access to economic opportunity, the fact that we are at a humanitarian crisis. What is the most important topic that we need to discuss? Am I being selfish and just focusing on my own gender? Or do I look at the well-being of the whole nation? So this is where it gets personal. We have people that are extremely hungry. We have the international community to blame at the fact that there are literally no economic opportunities because what's happening to freezing the money, and the fact that most of the country was 99% run by donor organizations, and now most of the country is left unemployed. And the fact that we have engineered, especially women in the urban areas, to become these warriors, and left them to with very few tools on how to engage with the current administration. I struggle very much with what topic do I discuss first. I think, one of our organizations say that women's rights is a human right, or the United Nations. And but at the same time, what I'm afraid is if I don't continue to talk about how women are at a disadvantage, then it will just stay as a status quo. The one thing that the Taliban have been consistent on is their messaging. They have not incorporated women in any of their communication on how they're going to engage with them, how they're going to apply their governance towards them. And their consistency speaks loud that they are not going to value or give as much value. But we can't fight them with this. We have to show them. Remember, as I mentioned, that they're not experienced individuals that can run or govern a country. Applying war tactics and fighting violence, that's so much simpler than actually running a proper government system, and to upholding human rights orders around the country. So how do we act with them? So if I take a step back and I'm trying to be extra careful in making sure that my women are not at risk, girls in Her Afghanistan, is it wrong for me to say take smaller risks? Do not risk your life at the risk of being flogged or possibly killed or kidnapped. We also have to look at the aspect that there's criminality on the rise in Afghanistan, and that this is also a huge contribution to violence against women. And one last thing that I really want to emphasize is that In our religion, women can succeed, but it's the culture that's used against her. And it's the culture that's actually being misinterpreted and somehow embedded in the wrongful use of Sharia. And this is very concerning and stressful, and which is why any international organization that wants to have anything to do with women's rights needs to have a female Islamic scholar at their board of directors or in their consultation process or anything, because if you don't use the language of the oppressors, then you won't be able to advance. I'm going to leave the floor now, and if there are any questions, it would be best to hold some sort of dialogue versus me giving a speech,
Thank you so
especially
much.
with all the respectable individuals on the panel. So I thank you for allowing me to speak first.
Well, thanks also for the reminder of how this problem also has historical roots, and for how long have people of Afghanistan had to face difficult circumstances, especially the women. You did pose this one question about women's rights and human rights, and within what spectrum do we locate it? I feel like that is the perfect opportunity to bring in our other speakers, and I'm sure all of them have a perspective on this as well. Heather, if I may ask you to take the floor.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me today. It's great to be here with all of you. And thank you for those comments, Mariam. So we're a human rights organization. We monitor human rights abuses. And you know, we were watching along with everyone else in shock on August 15th as the Taliban regained power over Afghanistan. I think on August 17th, we had a moment when we felt a little bit hopeful when the Taliban gave their first press conference and talked about how men and women were equal and women would enjoy all of their rights. And I think we had a moment of really thinking, okay, this may still be a really bad development, but at least the indications are that it's not going to be the same as 2001. But you know, really starting the next day and pretty much every day thereafter, there have been more and more signs that that the situation is really not very different from how the Taliban viewed women's rights in 2001. And so just yesterday, actually, we launched sort of a list of Taliban policies that violate women's rights, because it was getting too long to keep up, honestly. It was getting hard to keep track of all of these new developments that were happening day after day. Just to outline some of the major ones, I mean, one thing that's particularly devastating is that this is the 12th day since secondary schools for children grades 7 through 12 reopened for boys, but not for girls. And so every day that goes by is a day that millions of girls are being denied access to education. And the Taliban has said, you know, this is not a permanent decision. They're figuring out what steps they need to take to be able to reopen schools. Those schools were already segregated by gender. And so it's difficult to understand what it is that they need to figure out. And, you know, it's impossible not to remember that from 1996 to 2001, when they were previously in power, they never said, you will never be allowed to study, you will never be allowed to work. What they said was to women and girls was that the situation was not right, the security was not good, and they needed to be patient and wait. And women had no choice but to be patient and wait, but the moment when there were more freedoms never came during that period of 5 years. And so I think there's reasonable skepticism about whether that moment will ever come this time either. Lots of restrictions on women working. You know, originally the Taliban said that women should stay home and not go to work because their fighters were not trained and might mistreat women. Since then, there have been additional details like the Kabul government dismissing women except for those that they think can't be replaced by men, such as toilet attendants. We've seen pretty much the entire dismantling of a system that women's rights activists fought so hard to build to respond to cases of gender-based violence. The 2009 EVAL law, a system of shelters across the country, specialized prosecution and prosecution units and courts. Women's access to healthcare is being compromised by requirements that are being imposed in a lot of places that women have a mahram with them, a male family member escorting them, and that they only see female healthcare providers. Women's sports seem to have been banned. So I could go on, but I'm going to stop and talk for one quick second about what should the international community do about this, and then I'll let you turn to your other speakers. I mean, the first thing I would say about the international community is that it has a responsibility to the women and girls of Afghanistan. The 2001 intervention by the US-led coalition after 9/11 was sold to voters and taxpayers in the US and in every other country that participated by talking about the situation of Afghan women under the Taliban. And even though we know that that was never the real reason for the war, I think that that creates an ongoing obligation, as do the promises that were made over the last 20 years that, you know, the international community would always stand by Afghan women, would never abandon them. And I think that we're seeing those promises broken right now, but there's still an opportunity for the international community to behave with more integrity toward Afghan women. I think it's a challenging task for the international community. It's hard to know what areas the Taliban is willing to compromise on and what incentives they most want from the international community. And the Taliban is also under pressure, of course, from more extreme elements within their own ranks, and so that's pulling them in the opposite direction. Then there's the humanitarian situation, which you mentioned, Mariam, which is devastating and getting worse every day. The United Nations Development Program is estimating that by the middle of next year, 97% of Afghans may be living in poverty. There are already 3.1 million children who are facing extreme malnutrition. So that's an emergency that has to be dealt with this second. And I feel like we're not seeing the level of urgency in the international community that we should be seeing on finding solutions for that. And humanitarian assistance can't be used as leverage. It can't be a bargaining chip. The international community has to save the lives of Afghans and not use their well-being and their lives as a way to punish the Taliban. But that should still leave some forms of leverage, including international recognition, including how aid is funneled into the country, whether it goes through the government or around the government, issues about sanctions, which can be effective if they're narrowly tailored. And so we really want to see the international community come together in as united a way as possible and use the leverage that it has to push the Taliban to say, in 2021, you can't be operating this kind of a state that completely disenfranchises half the population. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. I would actually like to bring in Ambassador Puri and Mamta after that to address also what Heather raised. Are we seeing the international community deal with this in the urgent manner that it needs to? The floor is yours, Ambassador Puri.
Thank you. And it was really good that we had Mariam and Heather set the stage for our discussion. I would like to bring in the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 of 2000 on women, peace and security, which is and Afghanistan is a poster child of that resolution, and the reviews also of 2015 and 2020 that were carried out very clearly confirmed that women's voice, participation and leadership in peacemaking, in peace building and peace keeping and nation building is indispensable to achieve sustainable peace, development and just societies in states like Afghanistan. And conversely, because women's rights, as was mentioned by Mariam, have been systematically violated and they are excluded from governance, from peace and nation building, conflict has become endemic. So it's no wonder then that Afghan women's role and their rights have come center stage with the sudden takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban on 15th August 2021. Now, as we heard, Taliban 1.0 was notorious for its violent suppression of women's rights, religious extremism, and the interpretation, as was rightly mentioned, of religion by them, as far as women's rights are concerned, and terrorism in Afghanistan. So in 20 years of US and NATO presence, and to be fair to them, and the UN supported successive Afghan government's efforts to reinstate a gender-responsive political, social, economic, and cultural template under constant threat, even then, from Taliban terrorism. Despite efforts of well-meaning Western powers and the UN to include women in political negotiations to determine Afghanistan's future, they were largely left out of the peace table in Doha and elsewhere. The US's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan rendered women and girls of Afghanistan vulnerable to losing their hard-won rights, as was mentioned, at the mercy of the conservative, Islamist, militarist, and not only patriarchal, but misogynist Taliban 2.0 regime. So after August 15 takeover by Taliban, therefore, as UN Women and others reported, there has been incredible fear and uncertainty among Afghan women and girls and their families and their international supporters. Taliban's claim that women's human rights would be protected in keeping with Islamic Sharia laws portends their severe curtailment. So this is no Taliban 2.0 as far as women's rights are concerned. It's just the same. Taliban brutality towards women everywhere, with Taliban gangs going around, terrorizing women, flogging protesters, expelling women from schools and workplaces, going into homes to enforce Islamic morality is widespread. And much of it is going unreported, as was mentioned. One particularly heart-rending video of, I don't know whether you saw them, of Taliban fighters forcibly taking away a 12-year-old girl from her parents, wrenched all of our consciences. The expectations of Taliban being a woman-inclusive political force was quickly belied with the formation of a Pakistan midwifed, all-male, hardline, interim government of the Islamic Emirate, and what that means has been pointed out in Afghanistan, with many on UN's terrorist list. So they represent the twin forces of Islamist religious extremism and political power emanating from the barrel of the gun. So as feared, their first act was to abolish the Women's Affairs Ministry. It was replaced by the infamous Ministry on Vice Prevention and Virtue Promotion. They made black full burqa mandatory against tradition of non-Pashtun communities, as we know, and forbid women from working, restricted girls' education, no school, even Kabul University, they were forbidden to go, and banned women's sports, as was mentioned. They justified the missing women in government, citing women's sole role as childbearers at home, and citing their incapacity to carry so-called the weight around their necks. Afghan women across ethnic lines have braved coming out to protest against the Taliban and their Pakistani backers, and against the restrictions put by the regime on their voice, what I call the voice, choice, and agency. Taliban cracked down and prohibited protests without prior permission and mounted pro-government demonstrations by pro-Taliban women instead. So UN Women, which along with other UN agencies has supported a network of mostly Afghan women's human rights advocates and defenders, politicians and journalists, it has expressed concern that these vital groups may be hounded and harmed, and Mariam referred to that harm. Amidst this rollback, women face the brunt of growing human rights and humanitarian crisis, which has been referred to by both Heather and Mariam, and violence and restrictions, impelling them to leave Afghanistan. But they are also the least likely to make it out safe. Most important instrument for holding the Taliban accountable to women's human rights protection and promotion is the India-steered landmark resolution 2395, which was passed on 30th August, and sets out 3 benchmarks on women's rights. That the Taliban must safeguard the gains in human rights and the rule of law of past 20 years. It must respect and protect the human rights of women and minorities, and form an inclusive government through negotiated political settlement with the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. Other benchmarks like protection of civilians, right to leave Afghanistan, and access to humanitarian aid were also held out as criteria by which the Taliban regime's eligibility for eventual diplomatic recognition, legitimacy, financial unfreezing, and economic and humanitarian aid was made conditional. Now, emboldened by Pakistani support, Prime Minister Imran Khan, you would have heard on BBC, declared that women's rights cannot be imposed from outside. And Chinese and Russian abstention on the UN Security Council resolution has emboldened the Taliban to defy these injunctions. Moreover, the distress of the Afghan civilian population and UN Security and UNSG's humanitarian aid appeal of 600 million, over 600 million, could yield resources apart from what the Chinese have pledged. Thus,
Thank you, Ambassador.
I just want to make one point. Thus, once again, women's rights are likely to be sacrificed at the altar of realpolitik unless strict compliance is enforced. The red lines have been drawn. Now, if Taliban is allowed to get away with trampling on women's human rights, it has implications beyond the war-torn country in other Islamic and non-Islamic states and communities. It could embolden misogynist conservatives and fuel the fire of Islamic terrorist groups and copycat declarations abridging women's rights. And I will present something on India's perspective in a minute.
Yes, we would like to, in fact, come back to that. If I can bring Mamta in now, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Renana, and really good to listen to all the 3 panelists. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. Your insights on Afghanistan and all were really incredible, and I'm in a few levels away from it. So just talking at it from a UK government perspective, there were 3 big priorities right now that we were dealing with. Yes, Anena, you wanted to say something? Okay, so which was, of course, evacuation, resettlement. And now is the time we're looking at how do we coordinate a more structured international response, which goes beyond humanitarian to a longer term impact. I mean, like Mariam mentioned, poverty is going to really rise. UNDP estimates say something around 97% are going to be below poverty line in a year's time, which is huge. How does a country recover from it? So I think that's something that's top priority for us. As our international, we underwent an international strategic review recently. Girls' education, open societies continue to be a core priority for us. We've increased overall humanitarian package for Afghanistan. But like I said, the real test now is to find the kind of partners, 3 tests I would say. How do we find the neutral partners? And there UN will play a big role, who can channelize this aid effectively, right? The second would be, how do we use the international committees and international forums, whether it's G7, UNSCC, more effectively and maintain the presence of and involve women mediation, women leaders in mediation, because many times that's completely absent. How do we have a robust monitoring mechanism in place? And the third point, which Mariam also referred to, and so did Heather, is how do you negotiate? Who do you negotiate with? Because there's this complex mix of politics and pragmatism versus principles. So how do you actually go around? How do you talk? How do you negotiate without compromising on the other things? And my final point is that, yes, women's rights, we have to look at it from the wider economic rights perspective as well. And if, the health and well-being of very vulnerable communities, the rural-urban divide. I mean, all those also play a big role in how women's lives actually pan out. And again, I go back to the point about which Mariam also referred to around culture, about really understanding the women in Afghanistan are not one big monolithic group, but actually there is a lot of diversity. There are a lot of different complexities within regions, within subcastes, and so on. And the fact that what are the opportunities that they can actually we can actually provide them in the kind of circumstance and the lives, the context they're living with, and our aspiration to see them becoming real challengers and warriors. But I do see also that I mean, I'm speaking now as somebody who's been in this field for so long and someone who works on women's rights. How do I actually translate my intent into action? How do we work together? I mean, so that's the bottom line. How do we work together? Who do we work with? How do we maintain our political positions while combining with pragmatism and really making a difference on the ground? Yeah. So I'll just leave it at there. Let's look at solutions together. That's where my personal interest also is, to learn from all of you. Thanks.
So with all due respect to all of my colleagues that are on the panel here, there's one thing when we talk in theory and we talk about resolutions and we talk about laws and we talk about how we need to uphold the Taliban to these standards, then there's the reality. And the reality is that misogyny, oppression, is one of the core unspoken beliefs of the Afghan culture. And this is something that has not only been prominent amongst Taliban, this has existed for a long time. I'm not sure if many of you are aware, in the recent Ministry of Justice meeting with the Chinese ambassador, the Taliban minister had mentioned that he's going to bring back the 1964 monarchy constitution, and they're going to temporarily uphold that. And this was the same constitution that Karzai had upholded the first few years when he came into as interim president. So I mention all of this because when you look at the constitution, there's nothing that highlights women's rights at that time. But there were rights. The question here is, what in the culture, how can we be practical and work with the Taliban in order to bring some sort of stability and opportunities for the Afghan people? And then we talk about trying to regain the progress. First and foremost, what's important is during the past 20 years when we've had democracy, over 2/3 of the girls did not attend to schools. Why? Did that have to do with the fact that there was limited access and due to the corruptions, because many of the girls did not have 4 walls? Did it have to do with the fact that the districts, the village elders did not believe in the girls getting education? Because it's very hard to accurately get that information. But you also see the disproportion of people attending to schools at a young age. So there's a wide range of unexplained events that are taking place. But what's important is what's happening now. Heather rightly mentioned, yes, 12 days the girls have not been in school. But what's the reason and how can we push this forward? We can talk about the UN, which, by the way, I would like to clarify, that has acted as a failed institution during this whole process and has delayed its response to the Afghan people when it should have been the first actor in this whole disaster. We also have to blame all the international actors in the sense of what kind of chaos they brought to the Afghan people. I will never forget watching people fall from the plane at the airport. All of these are major contributions to foreign institutions that have been involved in Afghanistan. And the reason why we have to hold them responsible, because we can't be hypocrites and not hold institutionals responsible and then only hold the Taliban responsible for the oppressions that they continue to cause. The Taliban are influenced by a few nations. So we see that very clearly. We have our neighboring countries, which is Pakistan, you have Russia, you have China, you have Iran that has an influence, but then there's also these silent actors that the Taliban have major respect for. You have Saudi, you have Qatar, you have Kuwait to a certain extent, you have the UAE. These foreign institutions that are mainly West-based need to use these other actors in this process as their allies in order to raise awareness and to raise access for Afghans and mainly the women. How can you do that? Okay, aside from the fact that I can't keep it more prevalent to explain that international donors have all withdrawn their support into Afghanistan, which has caused the economic crisis right now. Besides humanitarian crisis that we need to address, which also comes with contingencies. So there's two types of licenses that the United States has provided for organizations to provide humanitarian assistance, but they are limited. And another thing is that organizations like mine, which is Her Afghanistan, who has 5,000 active members in the country, cannot work with UN designated terrorists. So I'm confused that what's the framework for individuals who have ground people who can mobilize, we have men and women. And we also have to understand that we need men to be allies for women in this process. We've seen women demonstrating, but we've not seen their brothers, sisters, fathers, or husbands come out and demonstrate. We need men voices. There was a really great case in Malawi that I really wanted to highlight here, is that sometimes bringing up certain issues have a really bad backlash. So my concern is when I keep bringing up women's rights, is this going to cause more of a backlash? Are they going to, because if we see what is happening with the Taliban, what in the possibly misunderstandings that yes, they're not letting girls go to school, but how many teachers do we have available? Are the teachers even getting paid? From my understanding on the ground, many teachers are not going back to work because they've understood that international donors have stopped their financial support. The same thing with the police. So there's other core aspects that we have to really look at. What's really happening? Where is the bottleneck situation? But who do we communicate? So again, they're UN designated terrorists. So organization like mine, if I engage and try to understand where the problem is, I could be also at risk. So the UN that acts like this institution that is supposed to provide assistance during a time of crisis has not provided a proper foundation on how other organizations can act to support the populations. So these are critical components. We are well aware of how devastating this whole situation has been, and more so what kind of monsters, creatures are running the current structure in Afghanistan. But the most important aspect of it is how are we going to work with them? What's the process? And is this going to be another corruption cycle where we see aid coming into Afghanistan, but it's going back into the wrong pockets? We have to be very cognizant in this whole process. Okay, I'm sorry about going off in a tangent, but I wanted to touch all of those aspects.
Thanks, Mariam. Heather, would you want to react to some of what she said, including the question that she raised that can this lead to some sort of backlash almost with the sustained focus that we have on this?
No, thank you for all those comments, Mariam. I mean, I think we don't have a choice except to focus on women's rights, talk about women's rights. I mean, one of the things that I'm really struck by, I mean, Lakshmi, you've talked about 1325, which of course is the foundation for a lot of these discussions, but I'm also struck by how, you know, in the last 20 years since the Taliban were removed from power, you know, we've seen this kind of rising discussion about feminist foreign policy. And I think that this is a moment when we find out what feminist foreign policy means, and if it means anything, in fact. And one of the things that I've been disappointed about is that I would have expected more leadership from the countries that had sort of proudly proclaimed that they have a feminist foreign policy than we've seen so far. And I think there's still still space for that leadership to emerge, but the time is right now. So I don't think that there's an option to sort of not highlight these abuses. I do think that I think your point is very well taken about which countries can influence the Taliban, and the need to have a kind of a united front that includes, to the greatest extent possible, those countries as well. And I note that some countries that you wouldn't normally expect to hear necessarily talking about women's rights are talking about women's rights in the context of their discussion with the Taliban. I also think sometimes people ask us, well, should countries recognize the Taliban? And I think that that's not an all or nothing question. I think that you can engage with the Taliban without recognizing their legitimacy, and there's no choice but to engage with them. And we see that lots of organizations that provide assistance are having discussions with the Taliban. Those discussions are happening from the national level in Kabul down to the district level, sometimes even the village level, as service providers try to negotiate. Are they going to be able to reopen that school that has both boys and girls as students? Are they going to be able to restart that aid program with their female employees being part of the delivery of services, and so on? So I think that these discussions are happening at many different levels, and I think that one of the points that I really take from Mariam's intervention a moment ago that's most important is looking for allies like Qatar and other countries that can play a helpful role and might be better at getting the Taliban's ear than countries like the US have been. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. I'd actually like to bring in Ambassador Puri now, and especially to address the point of has this moment also exposed the limitations of the United Nations as an institution, and what role do you really see the UN playing now on the ground as in its aid efforts and all such things?
Well, the United Nations is as good as what the member states who drive it are putting into the effort. And of course, there has been huge investment from all countries that were engaged there, the NATO, the US, and other countries, and the West. But also other countries, including India. They have invested on the development side, on other side. I mean, India has invested, as a developing country, it has invested $3 billion into various development projects. But now I want to, relate it to not only UNAMA, whose mandate has now been extended, but how do we redefine the mandate of UNAMA? Because there was a kind of time pressure, so the mandate of UNAMA could not be unpacked and redone, but they have now extended the mandate as it is. I would like to, if I may, relate it to Mamta's question. So how do we go forward? We can find enough faults in how the last 20 years, who failed, how we failed, and both the national actors and international actors, how in different ways they made mistakes. But let's go forward and see what is the way that we can find ways to what Mamta raised, the question of being pragmatic, and also Heather raised this issue, and I think our friend from Afghanistan, Mariam, also raised this issue, is how do we use the path to humanitarian assistance, the path to restoring economic normalization and political normalization. How do we use that in a holistic way? And not necessarily, as you talked about backlash, I want to also relate to that. Not only in a women's rights perspective, but holistically address this in the larger context of humanitarian aid, economic normalization, political recognition, all of those parts. And I think the international community should work together on this. The problem is, as I pointed out, there is this geo-real politic happening. You know, we are not being united in dealing with this new regime. And that's what needs to change. And we have this instrument. We have the UN Security Council resolution, and let us not, let it go to waste. And I want to come back to India, and India as a pluralistic, democratic, country where Prime Minister Modi has put so much emphasis on gender equality and women's empowerment. I think we have a certain duty as well as inclination to support women's rights in Afghanistan. And apart from chairing the UN Security Council, where this resolution was adopted with a very strong gender equality, women's empowerment emphasis, there was also, for example, in the US-India joint communique on global good, there was a very specific reference to protection of rights of minorities and of women in particular. So there is that will. There should be also a demonstration of collective will in the international community, and to move towards engagement with the Taliban government in a concerted way to ensure that they come on board, whatever the background. I know that it's going to be a big challenge, but they are also keen to get legitimacy. They are also keen to get the money. They also don't want to fail. So all of that can be used as levers to get them to behave gender responsibly.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Puri. I would like to ask Mamta. So the list that Heather had actually referred to, where she's putting together all the very many ways that the Taliban is rolling back the rights of women, and it's being updated every day. One of the points in that I remember seeing is how female humanitarian workers will not be allowed to work on the ground. So my question to you is, first, as a development organization, what are the priorities that you see as of now to work on in Afghanistan? And the second is that the situation is as uncertain as it is. Most aid agencies are not sure if they will be, if they will have any presence on the ground, or will they have to work remotely. Working with those limitations, how do you see this evolving?
So yeah, Serena, I mean, the first priority was protecting, humanitarian workers at the time of crisis. When this, I'm sorry, I have a lot of noise in the background. Some election campaigns are going on, so
It's okay.
Can you hear me?
We don't hear the noise.
Yeah, the fun of elections and all the noisiness around it. Yeah, so you were asking me about humanitarian assistance, right? And what was our priority and how are we looking at it now? So yeah, I mean, the first priority was protecting the humanitarian workers and our teams there and the people who were working with us. So, evacuation, resettlement, that was the top priority. And even now, I think their security remains the most important, and that's something the different governments are negotiating or talking to Taliban. How do you ensure safety of humanitarian workers? There are some organizations, I believe, Aga Khan, Red Crescent, and all, who continue to work, who continue to engage. And we are sort of stepping back and looking at how do we move from humanitarian to a broader strategic framework, and how does those resources get deployed. So yeah, I mean, there is a very intensive consultation going on within the organization on the next phase of our strategy or support to Afghanistan. as well as looking at how do we partner, how do we cooperate with the wider community, international community. And I do think, and again, I'm talking more not from an institutional perspective, but more from my this thing. I think all the organizations, all the governments are really committing a lot, and I think we need to find a way on in holding them to account. Women's rights groups as to okay, you've made all these commitments. How much are you putting in place? What are you working on? How are you delivering? I think there has to be some framework. So while we are monitoring the human rights condition in Afghanistan, we also sort of monitor what are the commitments that are being made and how are they being delivered, how much money, how much of it actually goes down into this thing. So I think that's really important. Um, I think it's really also important then to identify those organizations in the ground, the networks in the ground that we can on the ground that we can work with. And Mariam posed a very practical issue about when I first heard that the new government had so many people who were on the list, UN list, and my first reaction was how's the world going to work with them? What is I mean, if you're not allowed to even talk to them, how are they running the government and so on? But I just fear this pragmatism and principles. How do we balance it all out? So on and so forth. So that's my internal confusion in my head. I'm sorry, I'm just sort of meandering a little bit because all of this seems very personal at some end. Though I'm not from that country. I'm not. But as a woman, as women's rights, and the wider issue of how do communities work with it? How do communities recover from something like this? You wonder. So I think there is a huge need to hold UN, to hold all the countries really to account, find ground level partners who can, who can deliver, and then continue to engage as a group, as a women's rights group, wider civil society groups, on Afghanistan recovery. That would be it from me, Sunena. Thanks.
Thanks, Mamta. You've actually posed some very important questions for us to think on and dwell on further. We have the last few minutes, and I want to also actually leave this thought and a question, and then turn to all of you for comments. I have heard many Afghan women say that if this had happened in any other part of the world, there would be more outrage. And what we're seeing is a form of gender apartheid, but that we are numb to it in a way, if not normalized, after decades of conflict. And how can we find a way to not be numb by this crisis? How do we just find a way forward from here? If all of you can just offer your concluding thoughts on this, we'll start with you, Mariam.
I think it's quite interesting because it's nothing but a repeat what we've seen with Iran, what we've seen with the women in Saudi. And I think what's more distraught to me is that yet we haven't been able to come with a network to become some sort of strong force. I think what I really want to request from the panelists here and their access to their networks and to all of your viewers is that we have to be extremely practical in moving forward. It's very time sensitive, and we have to try to make an influence where it's due. And that influence has a lot to do with theological discussion and dialogue taking place. We shouldn't make a mistake of what the Afghan government did and make this a political discussion when we should use religion as our force. Because the only way to dismantle abuses that are undergone under the campaign of Islam is to use Islam in its defense. I'm trying to be very practical here. There is a world of knowledge of the type of oppression women have faced, especially by dictator type groups, but the successes have only been seen after decades later. Now, one thing that the speaker before me rightfully mentioned is, Afghanistan has 75 to 85% of the population is going through some sort of mental trauma. And I'm sure that this is going to be another major shock, and how they're going to be recovering from it. They don't have that space to recover because they're trying to adhere to their daily social construction of life. the fact that life has been sucked out of Afghanistan after being so quickly injected in the past 20 years is devastating. And being cognizant of how abusive they are towards women and the type of gains we need to achieve, we have to be smarter than them, and beat them at their own game. And I speak very practically because I have been on world panels in different nations talking about this, and yet in different methods for talking about it, or using empirical data, theories, applications, but it never struck a chord with anyone. But maybe because of how sensitive the time is and how real it is and how close we are to it, we can try to address it in a more silent and aggressive manner, if that makes sense. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm in awe of all the panelists being so involved and personally invested in the women's rights aspect of Afghanistan. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mariam. Heather, would you like to come in now?
Sure. Thank you so much. I just want to mention a couple of the really concrete things that Human Rights Watch is advocating for. In the current Human Rights Council session, we're advocating for a fact-finding mission on Afghanistan. There's been discussion by some countries and entities, including the EU, about having a special rapporteur on human rights in Afghanistan. We think that that's not adequate. As all of you know, special rapporteurs have very few resources at their disposal to actually do their work. And so we think that a fact-finding mission would be a more robust mechanism, and that's really, really needed at this time. Second thing is, Ambassador Puri, you've talked about the renewal of the UNAMA mandate. So UNAMA's mandate has been renewed without changes in its in the content of that mandate for 6 months. Which we think is a really important and valuable thing, but there needs to be a lot of effort to make that meaningful. You know, a lot of the human rights staff working for UNAMA are outside of the country at the moment. They need to go back into the country. Offices that were closed in the past because of security considerations can now be reopened and should be reopened. There are gaps in staffing because there's been a hiring freeze related to the pandemic. Those positions need to be refilled on an emergency basis, and UNAMA needs to be doing monitoring and reporting, public reporting regularly across the entire country, particularly on the rights of women and girls, but on a whole range of human rights issues, because that's the best mechanism that we have available to actually understand what's happening in Afghanistan in the days ahead. We're seeing a lot of inconsistency from one region to another. What the Taliban is saying in Kabul is not necessarily much of a reflection of what's happening in different parts of the country. And one of the things that the Taliban has been doing is really silencing Afghan media. So we're less and less able to rely on the Afghan media to be letting us know what's happening. The international media is overwhelmingly based in the capital and also leaving soon. So I see those two things as urgently important, a fact-finding mission and a really robust set of human rights monitoring and reporting by UNAMA. Thanks so much for inviting me today.
Thank you, Heather. Some very important priorities outlined by you. Ambassador Puri, your concluding thoughts.
Well, I think there has been outrage enough. I would say that and that was something that was heartwarming, that people felt that what was happening in Afghanistan is going to be a huge loss for women, and harm was coming their way. So that is the positive part. The question is, are we helpless? Is the international community going to be helpless in the face of what has happened? Because we have evacuated our embassies, we have all gone out, we have, frozen their assets, all of that. So that disconnect is happening, and that's where I think both Mariam and Heather and others have talked about combining pragmatism with, and Mamta, of combining pragmatism with insisting on principles. And I think Heather added this fact about finding. I think that's a very, very positive and important thing to do in order to shine the light on what is the ground level reality, which can then be reflected back to the Taliban. But whether they will allow or not, and whether their backers will allow them or not, so that's another issue. But certainly these are very positive things that we can do. And as I said, calibrate the relationship. Firstly, be concerted, the international, the Western countries, UK, the European Union, the US, all the major donors, they have power. So they have to exercise that power in a way that on one side, they should not lose leverage with Taliban, but use that leverage in order to nudge them towards, to push them towards becoming more gender responsive. So that's the way to go, that the influential countries have to exercise the influence in a in a calibrated way where they will get the right results, and at the same time, it's a mixture of incentive, disincentive, and educating them and enlightening them as you go forward. So that all of those have to be exercised. And of course, countries like India and the other neighbors have a role to play in this concerted action of the international community.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. The final word is for you, Mamta.
No final word actually. I mean, this conversation has been really, really good for me to understand many of the hard facts and how things are moving. I mean, my key takeaway from this is one, of course, how we need to find real pathways to work through. But I think as an institution, we will also be committed to work with organizations, with institutions who have that kind of ground connect, and we're able to so that the next phase of work that we develop in Afghanistan, we are conscious of this and we include it. And as an international community, like the other panelists have said, we have a more coherent approach. And the second takeaway is that we need to engage, work more closely with women's rights organizations, with organizations that are in Afghanistan. How do we do that is something I think probably as time passes, hopefully we learn it quickly. And third is to also for women's rights groups to be able to use the other levers, like Ambassador Puri also referred to, whether it's the economic, whether those are frozen assets. How do you use the other forums to push this point through of opening up for the rights? So I think that would be my takeaways, and some action at our end as an institution to be more pragmatic and more clear. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You've actually pretty much summed up the discussion with that, and some very sobering thoughts, but also this discussion has showed us that we can't look away and we must strive for a way forward. With that, I want to bring this session to a close. I want to thank our panelists for supporting this discussion and also for speaking so candidly with us. Thank you.